Welcome to the install video for the Happy Trails KLR650 skid plate. This skid plate is the Tougher Than Hell skid plate. It is actually a double thick layer of aluminum on the bottom for extra protection and a little bit more of a rugged skid plate that's able to handle a little bit more. The thickness of this new skid plate is 3/8 of an inch with the double plated aluminum versus 3/16 of an inch on the standard skid plate, which we already have on the bike here, which we're going to be replacing. This skid plate comes with this impact kit. This impact kit goes between the frame and the skid plate. The purpose of the impact kit is to absorb some of the impact so that the skid plate doesn't dent or bend, which would cause damage to the case. So this is an added bonus that comes along with the Tougher Than Hell skid plate that we are about to install. So the first step is to check that we have all of the parts with the kits, so we'll do that now. The impact kit should come with the main rubber piece, which should be about 8 inches long. It should come with these 2 rubber insulators here, and it should come with the bolt kit. Happy Trails has provided these 4 longer bolts for the initial install of the impact kit to apply pressure between the skid plate and the frame. Once those are installed, they can be removed one at a time and replaced with these shorter bolts to allow for more clearance between the skid plate and the case. The skid plate hardware kit should come with 4 of these M8 by 20 bolts. It should also come with 6 of these 8mm flat washers, 1 for each bolt, and then the other 2 belong to the U-bolt here that is going to be used for the front of the skid plate. It should also come with a 2 5/16 nylon locking nuts. This is also for the front U-bolt there. It should also come with a front black plastic spacer. That's what this is here. That also goes to the front U-bolt installation. And then the front U-bolt itself. And then the rear frame U-clamps. There should be 4 of these. And these 2 triangle pieces here are to replace what they call the bat wing. And I'll show you where that's at. We're not going to use these because we have the crash bars and highway pegs installed, so they're not necessary since we have that. And let me see if I can show you what I mean here. So you can see here on the front part of the frame, there's these 2 triangle pieces here. These belong to the highway peg. These are the Happy Trails highway pegs, and because we have that in place, we won't need the 2 triangle brackets that come with the skid plate. So with that said, let's start dropping the old skid plate. We're going to begin by undoing the 4 bolts underneath the skid plate here. And we're going to remove the current Happy Trails skid plate. If you have the stock skid plate, KLR650 skid plate, you might see something like this. This is the plastic skid plate that comes default with the KLR650. So you're going to have 2 bolts underneath, and then you're going to have another 2 bolts in the front there. And those 2 bolts in the front are going to be connected to these guys here. These are what those triangle brackets would replace if you don't have the highway pegs. And so these come stock on the KLR650. So these would be bolted to either side of the frame like this, and then the front of the skid plate would bolt through here and here. But since we've already got the stock skid plate off, we're going to start with these 4 bolts here, and those are, oh, also if you have an A model KLR, you'll only have 3 bolts to remove on the stock skid plate instead of 4. Both of these skid plates, both the single plated and the double plated, are compatible with all year KLRs, so that's something to keep in mind as well. Next, we're going to remove the two lock nuts from the U-bolt on the front of the skid plate, and then we're going to drop the skid plate down. Just remove that U-bolt. So now if we put these two skid plates back to back, you can see the thickness difference between the double plated and the single plated. Before we lift the skid plate into place, we need to install the impact kit. And to do that, we're going to first take the paper backing off the adhesive of the rubber insulators, and we're going to stick those to the bottom right and bottom left corners of the skid plate here. The main rubber for the impact kit does not have adhesive on it. It's held in place by the pressure between the skid plate and the case, so it needs to end up about in this position. The biggest thing you want to make sure to do is to not cover the oil bolt hole here when you're putting this in place, otherwise you'll have difficulty accessing that. So as we lift this up into place underneath the motorcycle, we'll make sure that this stays about in that same position as we bolt it on. So we're going to begin by bolting the U-bolts on up front, which was the last step that we did when taking off the old skid plate. So that'll be the first step that we do when putting on the new skid plate. This helps if you have two people, but it can be done with one. Now before we slide this U-bolt up the frame, just double check and make sure that your impact kit is in place, right where you want it, not covering the oil bolt hole, and just lift it straight up. And we'll tighten this U-bolt down just a bit just to hold it in place. Now what we can do is drop our clamps in over the frame. And then once we have our clamps in place, we're going to start with these longer bolts here, and we're going to feed those through into the clamps and leave everything loose. We just want to get everything kind of started and then slowly tighten everything down until we get it tight enough where we can replace these longer bolts with the shorter ones once we have the impact kit kind of cinched down in there. Okay, now that we got that cinched down in there, we're going to go ahead and replace those longer bolts with these shorter ones to give the case more clearance. Just place a washer on the end of each one of these. And remember, I've left the U-bolt in the front. It's not tightened down all the way yet. We're going to get these in place, get everything almost tightened down, not all the way, and then we'll tighten everything up. One other note to add, if you're not using the highway pegs here and you're going to use the triangle brackets that came with the kit, those will basically replace the stock. They call it, I've heard it referred to as the bat wing, the two pieces on either side of this. Those will basically replace those, and it will end up looking like that. So that's going to hold the motor to the frame there. Now the final step here, before we tighten down all the bolts, is to center the skid plate. So what we want to look for when we do that is, number one, make sure that your oil bolt is centered in the oil bolt hole underneath the skid plate. We also want to look at the side of the skid plate here to make sure that your doohickey adjustment is accessible. And then we also want to center from left to right. So we want to make sure that the gap between the case and the skid plate here is about the same as the gap between the water pump housing on the other side. And you can see that here. Now that we have the skid plate centered, we'll go ahead and tighten up the U-bolt lock nuts on the front here. And we only want to tighten them down to where there's only a couple of threads showing. There's no need to over tighten these. That's about good right there. And then we'll go ahead and tighten up the bolts underneath the skid plate, and we've got ourselves a new skid plate installed and ready for adventure.